I had no idea we had so much in common, Chris. No wonder we get along so well. Well, I wish I had Chris's organizational genius. He is a powerhouse when it comes to getting things done. And I would say that in all these things we do, all this arts business, and the real payoff is the friendships we form and the community that comes together. And getting to know the Bairds and Bill Bennick has been a real payoff for me. It's been a wonderful experience. Just like getting to know Glenn and Allison so well, we work together all the time. We fight and argue. We try to calm each other down. And all of that is just, it's what life is about. Someone asked me once, what is the real point of the gospel? And my answer was association. It's doing things together in families and in church and everything. So anyway, it's a great privilege and honor to be a Latter-day Saint and to enjoy these wonderful experiences together. The festival this coming year in June in New York has as its theme Art and Vision. And it's meant, as I said earlier, to note the 200th anniversary of the first vision. We felt like we had to do something along that line, and it's a big year for the church. It's a big year for all of us. So that's our theme. I met one of the board of directors for lunch in Salt Lake as we were just developing this theme. And I said, this year we really feel like we have to note this great anniversary that's coming along. And she says, oh yes, that's right. Women's Rights Amendment was passed 100 years ago. And I was taken aback a little bit. But of course, she was right. This is another big celebration this year for the 19th Amendment being ratified. And so really it was out of that moment that the theme for this festival came into being, that we felt like we needed to honor women, partly because of that occasion, but also because it's long overdue. So we have this great show that Ashley Whitaker and others have put together. Well, my talk today is meant to bring together both of these themes. Joseph, famous for his first vision, and Emma, one of the most powerful women in our history, and probably, I would say, the most influential person in Joseph Smith's life, going beyond his parents or his family or his close associates. She was a wonderful woman, as we now appreciate. Though there was a time when she was sort of wiped out of our history. And there was a reason for that. It wasn't just she was a figure who fell sort of into disuse or forgotten through the vicissitudes of history. But there was an active effort to suppress her importance in the early church. And there were reasons for that, many of you are familiar with. First of all, she didn't go west. She couldn't stand Brigham Young. She couldn't stand polygamy. She was, immediately after Joseph Smith's death, she pulled away from the church, even old friends like William Clayton. She sort of kept at a distance. She didn't get involved in things. The reason was she was worried about her children. She was afraid that Joseph's property, which was all mixed up with the property of the church because he was trustee in trust, would be taken away, and that she wouldn't be able to support and raise her family. I don't think there was any real plot to deprive her of her property, but it was a genuine fear that she felt, so that sort of cooled the distance, cooled the relationship with Brigham Young. He, on the other hand, was genuinely worried about her. At the time that Joseph died, there were sort of two models of church government and succession. One was the one we're familiar with, coming down through the councils of the church, to the church organization where the keys were located. And the other was familial, coming down from father to son, for which there was also precedent in the church. In the patriarchal line, for example, the patriarchal office was a familial line. And Brigham Young was generally concerned about Joseph Smith III as a rival for authority in a time when it was still under debate, when it was still in memory of the time when there was concern and dispute about who should take over Joseph's job. So Brigham Young was wary of the Smith family because it was some challenge to his authority. And so he made an effort to discredit Emma, and she was sort of kept out of sight for many years, discredited in one way or another. I remember the time in 2005 when we were celebrating the 200th anniversary of Joseph's birth, and there was a great broadcast. There was someone up in Sharon, there were people in Salt Lake, and all of us around the church listening in. And President Packer gave one of the prayers in which he prayed to God that we would honor our prophet Joseph Smith and his very faithful wife, Emma Smith. And that was, I felt, sort of a formal rehabilitation of Emma. And since that time, she's become a heroine, not just to the women of the church, but to the men too, because of her courage and her strength and her testimony and the hardships she had to endure, but which she did endure so fabulously well. So now we have a chance to sort of think again about what part she did play. She came on the scene, as we know, very early. It was after the first vision in 1820, after the first visit of Moroni in 1823. She enters Joseph Smith's life in the fall of 1826, when he was almost 25, when he was almost 20, and she was 21. She was a little over a year older than him. And he met her when the Smith family had, father and son anyway, had gone to southern New York to help Josiah Stoll try to uncover a Spanish mine. It was thought that there was reason to believe, or rumors, or some kind of clues, that led Josiah Stoll to believe that there had been a gold or a silver mine, and that the Spanish had mined it, and then they had minted coin, and that this coin would be discovered. And Joseph was brought down because he was famous for his ability to find things, lost objects, using a seer stone in the neighborhood, and had been persuaded by his father to help find lost treasure around Manchester, where they lived. And Josiah Stoll wanted to take advantage of this gift to try to discover this mine. So he brought them down, and Harmony, where Emma and her father, the Hales, lived, was close to the mine, and Joseph Sr. and Joseph Jr. Boarded at the Hale home. And there they met. Joseph was not very sympathetic to this whole operation. He tried to persuade Josiah Stoll to put it away, and so it's the whole venture kind of collapsed after a little while, and he went back home. But he came back later to work on Josiah Stoll's farm, and while he's there, Emma comes to visit him, and they talk about marriage and are married. And this was sort of a bride-stealing operation, because her father had opposed the marriage, as we know, because he didn't think that Joseph had a respectable way of making a living. But they decided to marry anyway, and she did not go home. She came to visit Joseph, and she did not go home because she knew her father would be so angry. Instead, she and Joseph moved up to Manchester to live with the Smith family in their house. And so she is there in the fall of 1827 when Joseph Smith goes to the hill to find the plates. This is he started in 1823. This is 1827. So he's been there every year during that period. And they go together. Joseph was worried that people in the neighborhood would interrupt his attempt to recover the plates. These are the treasure seekers he had worked with before, and they felt they had a right to whatever he discovered because they'd been partners. And he knew it was something different than an ordinary treasure, and so he had to elude them. So as Lucy tells the story, late one night, she's on the eve of September 22nd when he's supposed to go. She comes down, Lucy's around the house, and Emma comes down dressed in her riding cloak. And shortly after midnight, getting them just over the line into September 22nd, Emma and Joseph go off together in a wagon to the hill. There's some thought, some people say, though I don't know if it's true for sure. Oh, that's my talk.
I'll try to get it in order.
No.
You can get it? Okay, good.
I'll sit here and shuffle through these papers. Yeah, very funny. Hold on a second here. Yeah, here we go. So, I should know this by heart. I've lived with this guy for so long. Yeah. There we go. That's the missing page. Good. Thank you, Allison. There had been, some people said that the Lord had told Joseph Smith that there were certain people he should bring with him to get the plates, and that he had been commanded to bring Emma with him. I don't know the veracity of that. It's sort of one of those rumors that we don't know if it's exactly true, but they did go off together, and it was a long time. They left shortly after midnight. They didn't get back till after breakfast the next morning. And Lucy was very worried about whether or not Joseph Smith had the plates, and he didn't. He had left them behind, either in the top of a tree or in a hollowed-out log, but he had brought home the Urim and Thummim. So the two of them arrived together with the news that the plates had been obtained, and were able to let Lucy, Joseph's mother, feel the Urim and Thummim under a cloth. So Emma is there from that point on. I always wonder about the moment when they're courting, and Emma knows that Joseph has had this unusual background, but how much did she know? Did there come in a courtship when Joseph turned to her and said, "Emma, there's something I have to tell you"? And how much did he say about angels and divine beings shown to him in gold plates? But sooner or later, she knew the whole story. So they have the plates then in the fall of 1827. It's a very unstable situation. The neighbors are harassing them, especially the money treasure hunting people. And Emma writes to her father and says, "Can we move back home?" And her father, who loved Emma very much, agreed that they could come down and work there. So they moved down back to Harmony, And that's where most of the Book of Mormon was translated. Not all, but the larger part of it. From that point on, Emma really played a very important part of the translating. As we know, Joseph didn't look at the plates and write things out himself. He dictated the translation to someone, and that someone was Emma for a long time, for the early portions of the plates. And she wrote about that, or she spoke about that, when her son interviewed her late in life, and she had these very strong memories of having gone through the translation process. This is what she said. I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting at the table close by him. He sitting with his face buried in his hat, with the stone in it, and dictating hour after hour with nothing between us. No curtain at this point because the plates are not visible. He had neither manuscript nor book to read from. If he had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me. There was this hypothesis going around that he had been given a manuscript by Sidney Rigdon, so-called Spalding manuscript, and that he was just reading it off and not translating at all. And so Emma makes a point of saying, no manuscript. If he had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me. The plates often lay on the table without any attempt at concealment, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth, which I had given him to fold them in. I felt of the plates as they lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape. They seemed to be pliable, like thick paper, and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one does sometimes thumb the edges of a book. Oliver and Joseph wrote in the room where I was at work. He could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictating a book like the Book of Mormon. It's a little bit of a backhanded compliment. But she knew him. She knew his degree of literacy, and she marveled. Here she goes on about her involvement. When acting as his scribe, he would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or after interruption, he could begin at once where he had left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this, and for so ignorant and learned as he was, it was simply impossible. I think you could make a case that Emma Smith bore the most powerful testimony of the restoration in Joseph's lifetime, because she not only came to believe at a point when Joseph had nothing. He didn't have a church. He didn't have followers, except maybe Oliver and Martin. He didn't have the Book of Mormon yet, just this manuscript that he was creating. Moreover, she not only believed when there was so little to go on, she gave her life to him. She said, I will be yours. So she made a kind of commitment that no one else did. And then she was close to him right to the end. She saw how it happened, and she still believed. And she knew his characters. Wives know all their husbands' weaknesses and flaws, and yet she still believed in him and in the Book of Mormon. when the 116 pages were lost and Joseph was distraught, having left Emma just after the birth and death of their first child, when she's ill, and Martin Harris is left with 116 pages, and he wonders where they are. He's filled with fear that something has happened to this precious manuscript that has been created, and he leaves her behind and goes and discovers the horrid truth that the manuscript is lost, and is thrown into a frenzy, paces and weeps. And what did he exclaim when he did? What will Emma think? He knew how much she had given, how much she had trusted, and here the whole undertaking seems to have faltered and fallen into the dust. He had a revelation for her. I think there were a number of these private revelations in those early years to this person or that person, many of them echoing the same words with the same kind of call to his brother and to his father and to the Whitmers. But he had a revelation for Emma, which is the most detailed, the most individual, and in some ways the most inspiring. He really saw her as his ally and collaborator right from the start. This revelation was given just after the church was organized in 1830, and just after she had been baptized, and said many things. We all know that she was called to collect hymns, but she was called to be a scribe to Joseph, which she had done, and was possible for the future. She was ordained to expound Scripture. He was to lay his hands upon her to receive the Holy Ghost, and then give her time to writing and learning. I think if she'd been an artist, like many of you in this audience, he would have said paint. If he'd married Minerva Teichert, he would have given her great encouragement to paint. But he told her to write and to learn. She didn't fulfill all those. A little disappointing to Claudia that she didn't write and learn like she should have. But the calling was there and waiting for her. Another of the callings, which I emphasize, Claudia thinks it's a minor calling, and that was, the office of thy calling shall be a comfort for my servant Joseph Smith Jr. I think that she was to comfort thy husband in his afflictions with consoling words in the spirit of meekness. And I think that's a far more important calling than maybe any woman in the room can fully recognize, because men do need to be consoled when difficult times come. And Joseph was particularly given to mood swings, to depths of despair and gloom, and he needed Emma to pull him out of those depths, and she was expert at doing it. They had a very tough life together, 11 children. 6 of them died within a year, beginning with the firstborn and going on down. You would think that fact alone would make Joseph wonder and Emma wonder, is God really with us when he lets our children die, our favorite little babes disappear? But it didn't deter either of them. He's tarred and feathered by his neighbors. She has to pick that tar off of his body that night. He was harassed by creditors, thrown into prison, accused of treason, put on trial for his life. And she was the one that he turned to in his moments of greatest need. And he opened his heart to her. I often say that if you want to know the inner Joseph Smith, you want to read his letters to Emma. They are the things that tell what he is really feeling and worried about. I think even more than his brother Hiram. One of the most excruciating sets of letters come out of 1832 when Joseph, with other leaders of the church, had left Kirtland and went to Jackson County to meet with the saints there. And on the way back, there was a runaway carriage accident, and Newell K. Whitney broke his leg. And Joseph has to spend a month nursing him back to health before he could even climb in a wagon and move. And it forced Joseph into inactivity, which was poison for him. If he's alone and inactive, those are when the blues would come over him, when he would be filled with despair. And during this time, he wrote to Emma, and some of the despair he felt came out of his letters. Maybe a little exaggerated because of the times. You know, we all at certain times can only think of all the failures in our lives, all the things that have gone wrong, all the stupid mistakes we've made, and we feel like our lives are complete failures. Other times we're not all that bad. But Joseph had those moments when he just felt his errors. This is what he wrote to her. I've called to mind all the past moments of my life, and am left to mourn and shed tears of sorrow, for my folly in suffering the adversary of my soul to have so much power over me as he has had in times past. But God is merciful and has forgiven my sins, and I rejoice that he sendeth forth the Comforter unto as many as believe, and humbleth himself before him. Sounds very much like Nephi lamenting, "O wretched man that I am." And then after confessing his misery to Emma, he writes, I will try to be contented with my lot, knowing that God is my friend. In him I shall find comfort. I have given my life into his hands. I'm prepared to go at his call. I desire to be with Christ. I count not my life dear to me, only to do his will. Really, from the first vision on, Joseph felt a deep dependence on the atonement and the forgiving mercies of Christ. And here is one instance where it comes out in excruciating form. Of course, she needed consoling too, and I truly hope that Joseph reassured her of his love and affection. It certainly appears in his letters over and over again when he's away. He'll speak of how he missed her and the children, how much he loved them. Near the end of his life, when they were separated for a time, he spoke of her as my wife, even the wife of my youth and the choice of my heart. She is here, even in the seventh trouble, undaunted, firm and unwavering, unchangeable, affectionate Emma. Then, at the end, polygamy. Joseph was slow to practice polygamy. We don't know exactly when the revelation was first given. Most scholars now have more or less settled on 1831 when he's working on the Old Testament, revising it. And the business of polygamy came up to puzzle him. He delayed obeying that commandment. Usually Joseph was instantaneous almost in trying to obey everything the Lord said to him. He had a little fear of God. He thought of God as a friend, but also fear, and he had to act. But polygamy he put off at least for 5 or 6 years. Began practicing in a botched marriage with Fanny Alger that ended with them just kind of drifting apart. He wasn't helped at all by the Lord in instituting polygamy. It was a sort of an awkward time for him all. And then did nothing again until 1841 when he began taking wives in earnest, which he did until 1843. I don't know how much he told Emma about polygamy. She heard about it, of course, eventually, and it was a horrible dilemma for both of them. They both believed in his revelations. For both of them, plural marriage was very hard to take. She could not bear it. She gave him permission to marry wives and sort of at one point and sort of let it go for a few weeks, and then she couldn't go any further and required that they leave the house. By the summer of 1843, they're very close to divorce. There was a day when they spent it together, William Clayton tells us, and he could hear weeping and crying and talking and pacing. And at that point, they did not divorce, but he agreed to take no more wives. He married 2 sisters later after that, to whom he had already asked to marry him, and that was part of the deal. But this steady, every month, a new wife building up his group stopped, and Emma stuck with him through to the end. They were endowed and sealed together, which meant a lot to her, to be sealed to her husband for eternity. That was great importance. I think we get some sense of what kind of a woman she was in a document that is attributed to her. Claudia thinks it's valid. I think many women do. This is the famous patriarchal blessing that Joseph Smith couldn't give to her as he was going off to Carthage, but which he invited her to write a blessing for herself, and he would sign it. And these are some of the things that she is presumed to have written. I desire of the Spirit of the God to know and understand myself. I desire a fruitful, active mind, that I might be able to comprehend the designs of God when revealed through his servants without doubting. I desire a spirit of discernment, which is one of the promised blessings of the Holy Ghost. I particularly desire wisdom to bring up all the children that are or may be committed to my charge, in such a manner that they will be useful ornaments in the kingdom of God, and in a coming day arise up and call me blessed. She was a faithful, very good woman. She loved Joseph to the end. She was pregnant with the son when he died. The son was born in September after Joseph's death in June. When he came back from Carthage and his body was lying in state, the family was looking at it, she clipped a lock of his hair, which she kept in a locket all her life around his neck. She remarried Louis Biderman in 1847, 3 years later, but always kept a picture of Joseph Smith in her parlor. When she was asked by her son to talk about the early days, there's no bitterness in her testimony. She denied that he practiced polygamy. She never would admit that. But there wasn't bitterness in her. She had whatever bitterness she felt that had been purged from her by the end of her life. I think they were soulmates. She had many reasons to repudiate him, but she did not. She knew his humanity better than anyone, and she loved him to the end. I don't think Joseph could have endured all he did without her. And I think there are many lessons to be learned from this tale of this pair, but I think one of them is that we must all have someone that sustains us and whom we can sustain through all of our sorrows and trials. Well, I think that leaves us a few minutes for questions, so I'd be happy to entertain any that you would like to ask. If I can't find an answer, Claudia or Christine Haglund can certainly answer them for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your sort of contextualizing of the language about dioption be as a comfort to my servant. That helped me to that in a different way. Those words have been a little hard for me to swallow. I'm curious about another line in section 25 where the Lord tells her, murmur not because of the things which you have not seen. And, you know, presumably it's talking about plates, but in 1830 the plates are kind of in the rearview mirror at this point. Do we know that Emma ever did murmur because she saw not, or how do you interpret that line? Do you see it referring to anything else?
Yeah. I mean, there are two thoughts there. One, was she denied the right to see the plates in some active way? Or the other way around to put it, why didn't she see the plates? If Mary Whitmer saw the plates, why not Emma Smith? Why these 3 and 8 men saw it? I think that's the biggest piece of evidence that she was concerned about him, even though in her own patriarchal blessing, she says, I may be able to comprehend the designs of God without doubting. She's a very active mind. She's a thinker. She's a critical thinker. And these are the sort of things would occur to her. But I don't know elsewhere of there really being any evidence that she complained about it or that in any sense she was forbidden to see the plates or what. So I really can't help you more. It sort of remains a puzzle in many ways why she didn't see the plates. Or why they didn't all sneak a view of the plates. You know, they're there, they're under her bed at night. She could just sort of, ooh. But they were worried that God would strike them down if they looked at the plates. So I guess that's incentive enough.
How did Joseph get into the, kind of this hobby, I guess, of like treasure finding? Like, and had he found other treasure? Do we know? And you know, kind of like how did that kind of come about? Because he had found, people had heard that he had this vision and had gold plates, or because that was before, wasn't it?
Yeah, the treasure seeking was before. So the question, as I understand it, is how did he get involved in treasure seeking? And how did that relate to the gold plates and that sort of thing?
Well, just, how did he get involved in the treasure seeking
Yeah.
and have this reputation?
Yeah. It used to be a scandal to even think that Joseph Smith would be involved in treasure seeking because it seems sort of a desecration of a divine power or incongruous with being a translator. But just about the time I was first started to write about Joseph Smith, there was a flurry of scholarship that indicated that treasure seeking really is a very common element in rural culture in America and in England. And seer stones were fairly common. And at one point, on a very respectable level, there were members of Parliament who had seer stones in the 17th century. So his father got involved in it. It often was an occupation of the poor who, dream of finding treasures like people buy tickets to the lottery nowadays. And his father, who we would call it a superstitious streak, which is to discredit treasure seeking. That probably isn't quite fair because it comes out of an honorable and powerful tradition of magic that goes back through centuries and was filtrated all through society, but certainly to people on that level. So it's not just Joseph Smith, but a lot of the neighbors were out seeking treasure. I've had debates with Dan Vogel and others about how thoroughly this penetrated him. Some try to argue that Joseph Smith was a leader. This was sort of a career choice for him. He had this gift, and he would use the best of it. I see lots of evidence he dragged his feet along the line. He didn't. It was sort of a gift he had that he could sort of work tricks, but he didn't see treasure seeking as something he wanted to do. It was his father who got him involved. You could go on and speculate, did it play some role in the more serious calling of translation? And you can speculatively say it did, that it taught Joseph Smith to use stones for sort of supernatural purposes. And if he hadn't had that preparation, would he have known how to use the Urim and Thummim, or would it seem too alien to him? But he'd been practiced looking in stones before, and so it was a natural step into translation. So we're sort of in a whiffy realm, but I don't think we have to worry about the treasure seeking anymore as scandalous.
Did any of his descendants go west, or did they all stay? And were there any descendants with other wives, or were they just?
Okay, well, there are two questions there. No, none of his descendants came west with Brigham Young. Some of his sons came west to try to convert Utah Mormons into restored church Mormons, but no, and they just wandered the earth and disappeared. Someone told me there was 200 descendants of Joseph Smith in Australia, so they wandered, as I say, wandered the earth, who knew nothing about Joseph Smith. But during the bicentennial, efforts were made to contact them, and there was sort of a kind of a family reunion. And so your second question, are there any other descendants? No, there were lots of stories, not lots, but half dozen stories of people who said, my mother told me as she was dying that I was a descendant of Joseph Smith. And various forms of that, which formed a little body of evidence. But we've had a very good biologist look at all of those claims and do DNA testings. And neither the claimed male or female descendants are actually proved by DNA analysis to be descendants of Joseph Smith.
Could you share with us your personal journey that your passion became to research and study the prophet Joseph Smith?
The question is, how come I wanted to study Joseph Smith? These are sort of funny stories. They don't seem worthy of Joseph Smith, but I was at graduate school in Cambridge, and the ward was filled with business school students and law school students. And we would exchange notes about our career paths. They were totally dumbfounded that I wanted to be a historian. I mean, what is the practical good? They knew what they were going to do. They were going to become lawyers or businessmen. And so I had to develop some kind of a rationale for what I was doing, other than I just liked history. And so the rationale was, well, my aim will be sort of, over time, study the era of Joseph Smith sufficiently that I'd feel at home in it, and then someday write a biography of Joseph Smith. But I keep putting that off and putting it off. Finally, Leonard Arrington asked me to write a little portion of it as part of a series of that he had projected for a 16-volume history of the church, and mine was to be the first volume. And after that, I didn't go any further, and I kept putting it off, wanting to do other things. And finally, someone from the Smith Institute at BYU said, we think there's a need for a new biography of Joseph Smith. And I wasn't sure myself, but I looked around and finally was persuaded. And so I began writing in 1997 and finished in 2004 in time for the bicentennial. And, I felt like I was doing good work in trying to do it. It was interesting because 2005, when it came out, was the 60th anniversary of Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. Furthermore, my publisher was the same publisher as Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. So I told my editor, this is your chance to compensate for your past errors, which she agreed to. So that's how it came to pass. Yes?
We know Joseph had Emma do the hymnal. Do we know more about his feelings about art and the role they play in religious, like otherwise visual arts, other art forms?
We did very little about him in visual arts or formal kind of arts. We do know that there was a touring painting, a massive painting that called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. I think that was the name of it, something like that. That was being displayed in his house in Nauvoo. So at least was willing to entertain him. This is in the spring of 1844, not long before he died. So he goes at least that far. But I think what we have to realize is that Scripture is a form of art. That writing that he did, those revelations, they're powerful. When we think of the Lord just dictating them to him, and there's probably some truth in that. But also, his mind is involved in it. And getting together those words. Claudia and I have been reading the Book of Mormon, of course, for Come Follow Me. And that narrative of First Nephi is really powerful writing. It's so compact, just filled with action, so much involved. So if you're willing to look at it that way, there's a great deal of art in the writing of the Scriptures. In fact, at our June festival, we're going to have Joseph Spencer, who's one of our best scriptural exegetes, talk about Scripture as art. And we'll see what he has to say. Heather Belknap will also be teaching there, giving a talk there on visual arts as a form of revelation. Sharon.
One of the most important things that was said about Joseph is that his name would be had for good and ill, and there's a lot of things on the internet for ill. But what would you say to the rising generation after studying Joseph and Emma and all the context of their life? What is the basis of your testimony about Joseph Smith?
Yeah. Well, the basis of my testimony is, by this point I have many testimonies to Joseph Smith. There are many ways you could talk about it. My real testimony is what it does for me as a person to be a follower and a Latter-day Saint. It just makes me a better person. That's the biggest thing. But he's a very powerful person. I think he was absolutely sincere. I think he believed what he said. I think he had incredible resolve. I think he was deeply responsive to his revelations. He was in a way a victim of his revelations. He was always saying, in 1830, he says, all right, the church is organized, now we can sort of sit back and enjoy it. Then comes the revelation to Zion. He has to build a city. Then in 1835, he says the same thing. Then comes the revelation for a temple. We have to build temples. So in a way, he's a victim of his revelations. But he always responded to them and carried them out. And, he's one of, as our Adam Miller and others are now discovering, he's one of the most imaginative, creative theologians of the whole Christian tradition. Really a whole new view of God. So our gospel, whether we realize it or not, is revolutionary in Christian theological terms. So I think this is a person of very limited training who did miraculous things in very powerful ways. I will tell you, as I would say to any group of historians of any training, he could not have written the Book of Mormon. He just could not have done it. It's too intense, it's too complex, it ranges too far. It just couldn't have come from his mind or his lips. So all of these things sort of stacked together persuade me that he was an inspired person. Thank you, everyone. Nice to have you here.